Good morning. Did you like that one? I had like a robot voice on it or whatever, like an
I
announcement voice.
did. I'm even more excited to be live right now
I'm
because of that
having
introduction.
probably too much fun with the intros and stuff there. So, good morning, everyone. Good morning. We are actually we're in our Facebook group. We're also on Facebook, on Twitter with Periscope, on YouTube, and on Twitch. This one is we wanted to come live because, well, honestly, we haven't been live all week, and that's kind of we have been. You were live last night for the Master Chat recap, but
True, with Jamie.
We haven't been live. Like, it's been weird coming from 2 weeks of daily drop-ins to not. So we thought we'd jump in on a Friday. Hope you're having an awesome week. Hope you're having an awesome Friday already.
Maybe your first week of school.
Maybe your first week, right? So excited for that. We've had a lot of questions in the group, and before we go, one thing to note about this group is that if you're not in a private Facebook group, go to teachbettergroup.com or just search Teach Better Team on Facebook, and we'll get you in that private group. But what's so awesome is all these questions have already been answered multiple ways by multiple people on the actual initial post. But I wanted to bring you in and just throw them at you to let you kind of rant on them as well, because you don't always have a chance to get into all the questions specifically to the grid method in the group, even though I know you try too, and we do a pretty good job. But that's what we're going to do today. So if you're listening, and I'm going to throw this up on the podcast too as a bonus episode. So if you're listening on podcasts,
now the pressure.
Thanks. If you're watching, say hi. Some people jumping in. So we'll do this first. Joe, what's going on, buddy? Good to see you. He already listened to episode 200 of the podcast. Now listening to us again. I feel bad for you, Joe, but thank you. Candace is in. Candace, good to see you this morning. Candace, is Columbus back? Are you guys back in yet? Or is that not for a couple weeks? I think you guys took a couple weeks. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I love that she loved the content. That's great. Michelle's here. Good morning, Michelle. Good morning, Jillian. Good morning, Jan Reed. Good to see you. Canada's in the house. But yes, so good morning. Good morning.
Represented strong in our network. Somehow.
Yes. Love our Canadian friends. So what we're going to do today, Chad, is I've got screenshots. I'm looking at my other screen. I apologize. I've got screenshots of a few different questions that have been posed over the last couple of weeks in our Facebook group. And like I said, they've been answered. And I think most of them got the answers they needed. But I thought, let's put a quarter in Chad and let him go too, right? That's for Joe listening to the podcast. If you haven't listened to episode 200 of the podcast, we wanted to have some fun with it. So we actually had Chad and Megan Deegan, who's one of our ambassador program coordinators, and then also Caitlin Giordano, who's the boss, right? Had them on to chat with us, and we talked. We kind of looked back at 200 episodes, but it really got into more of a journey of the team and of individuals, and they also dropped some great tips and stuff like that. But we joked about just kind of like putting a quarter in Chad and letting him go, that he doesn't actually know what's going on, and it's fun. I think the first 10 minutes of that episode is really enjoyable. If you enjoy our nonsense. After that, you could probably stop listening. That's not true, because at the very end of the episode, everyone drops some really great knowledge and some really great tips and ideas and ways to look at this school year and stuff. So let's get into these. I'm going to bring them up on screen too here. So there we go.
Multi-part question.
So multi-part question, Jacob Santos. I'm going to read it for those listening on the podcast, Chad, just so they have it. It says, hi, everyone. I have questions on the grid method. Question 1, how does each grid more or less represent a unit? Number 2, how long should a grid take to complete? 3, how do you ensure when a quarter ends that each student has the same amount of work recorded in the grade book? Example, student A is working on level 4 and student B has turned in level 5. Question 4 is a grid provided to each student at the beginning? And question 5 is, how do you hold class-wide discussions on topics if each student is at a different place in the grid? No apologies needed there, Jacob. There's definitely a lot of questions, but all good questions and all very, very common questions.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think this summarizes the most common questions we get after teachers first learn about the grid method.
So let's take them one at a time, Chad. I'm gonna so one is, does each grid more or less represent a unit?
More or less, yes. Each grid represents a unit of study, which could cover one standard. It could cover multiple standards. You could have multiple objectives in there. It is not a single day. It is not a single lesson. It is a learning path that represents an entire unit pre-test to post-test. Every once in a while, teachers will get really confused and overwhelmed when they think a grid is supposed to be for like one day or something like that. And they're like, that seems like too much. And that's because it is. This is supposed to represent an entire unit with scaffolded assignments that takes them from pre-test and pre-learning all the way to post-learning and post-test, and even potentially beyond if they get into those higher levels 3, 4, and 5.
True or false? A grid, though, could represent less than a full unit.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some really beefy units out there. I know a lot of math teachers are like, I know this is a whole chapter or a whole unit that I normally teach, but I break it up into 2 parts. And the rule of thumb I generally have teachers use is, if you would normally break this apart, it should most likely be broken into 2 grids too.
Yeah.
So think about how you normally teach things. If you normally teach them broken apart, make broken apart grids, make 2 grids instead of 1. If you normally teach them in a longer unit, make 1 longer grid, right? Don't go crazy with it, but that's absolutely the case. It's most of the time it's unit to unit.
Yeah.
However, there are cases where if you want to break a unit up, or it's really, really beefy, or there's a clear transition between one part of the content and another, then you may get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to do 2 separate grids on this topic.
I think a good rule of thumb, Chad, is that if you have a worry that it's going to be overwhelming or have too much in a grid, break it up.
100%. Always
better. Yes. Go ahead. You were going to say what I was going to say.
Always err on the side of a shorter grid than a longer grid. Always.
You can always do 2.
Yeah.
Right? You can always underwhelm them by doing 2 or 3. It's hard to go from overwhelming because then you're going to have that stress.
There's a very real reason I say this, though, because like there's a very real thing that if you make a grid too long and it's not going well, you're then stuck in a grid that's not going well, and you're stuck in it for 5 weeks instead of 3 weeks or what have you.
That's a great segue into the next question. Question 2 that Jacob had is, how long should a grid take to complete?
That's a really loaded question. Actually.
I know, that's why I'm smiling.
So this Dave Schmedow just stopped in too, which is awesome. So this is a really loaded question, and it depends on a lot of different variables. It depends on how quick your students work, how fast they're growing, and how long you plan on a unit taking, right? Most of the time, okay, on average, I am not saying every grid in the world takes this long, but most grids take anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks, depending on what you put in them. I've had teachers do 1-week grids that are like little baby grids. I've had teachers do 8-week grids that are big projects where students are doing multiple things. So it really depends on what you put in there, how long those things take, but it also depends on how your students progress. If you get to week 2 and you thought your students were going to mostly be on level 3, but they're still on level 2, you may need to adjust. But a universal truth, Jeff, and you hear me say this all the time, is mastery learning takes longer, period. End of story. It will take longer than your traditional unit took. So if a unit normally takes you a week, maybe your grid will take you 2 weeks or a week and a half. It will take you longer. Also, I want you to think about something. You covering content in a traditional sense is very different from your students actively learning in the grid method. If I'm a teacher, I can lecture for 5 days and cover 8 chapters. I could literally cover a ton of material. And in my head, I can go, wow, I covered 3 units in 1 week or 2 weeks.
My students learned a lot in those 3 weeks.
Yeah, right. But the chances are your students didn't really learn a lot. They just heard a lot or forgot a lot or did these other pieces. Well, in the grid method, they're actively learning, wrestling with, being assessed, being intervened with, being checked in on. So it will take longer. It'll absolutely take longer. There's no ways about it. Like all the research says, all of our anecdotal evidence says it does take longer. But the caveat is students learn more. That's the payoff. It takes longer, but students learn more. So it will take you a little longer, but that's okay because you're getting more bang for your buck in terms of instructional time and how much growth you're seeing with your students.
Let's go to number 3. Part 3 of his question is, how do you ensure when a quarter ends that each student has the same amount of work recorded in the grade book? Example, student A is working on level 4 and student B has turned to level 5. And I know this could get very long and in-depth because a lot of it could be different based on how your school or how you report your grades and how your school requires you to and stuff. But
True.
can you give more? So maybe stay a little broader on that. But
sure, absolutely. So the simplest way to answer this question is all your students won't complete the same amount of work because they might not need to demonstrate mastery. Like, we need to stop this conversation. It is never, ever about how much work the students do. It's about how much mastery they show. I would also state that, and I know that's just me being super picky about the wording of the question, but that's
Sure.
one of those things that, like, it doesn't matter if they complete different amounts of work, because if they all have the same level of mastery, or if they all have demonstrated mastery to the standard, and that's my next point, it doesn't really matter. The other thing this kind of opens up, the kind of worms that this starts to open up, is the fact that not every student should get through the whole grid, or not every student will get through the whole grid when you don't normally plan it. I have 5 levels on the grid because some students will be able to extend beyond the standard. But your minimum goal for a grid is not every student gets to level 5. It's probably not even every student gets to level 4. It's that every student learns the standard, masters the standard. So if you, and this is a really good reflection for anyone using grids or anyone thinking about using grids, because I think it releases a lot of weight off of their shoulders. Stop thinking about it like you didn't finish the grid, so that's bad. Think about it as you either met or didn't meet the standard. So if the standard's written at DOK level 2, okay, that means in theory, if every student gets past level 2 in your grid, every student could have a quote unquote passing grade, whatever that means for you in your grade book in the class. That doesn't mean that that's the end of your grading scale, but it could be. Maybe that's your A for that grid, but maybe that's your low A, and then your high A is level 3 because it's beyond the standard, right? I'm not going to open up that whole standards-based can of worms because I could talk about that for another 30 minutes. But aside from the grading aspect, it's really about identifying mastery of the standard. So if you had a bunch of students, some on 4, some on 5, it's irrelevant if they both mastered the standard, and you can grade that accordingly. Level 5 should never be graded against the student because not every student should get there. I would also argue that anything above standard should have a minimal effect on a student's grade, and it should only have a positive effect on the grade, not a negative effect. For example, maybe you can get an A by meeting the standard, but you can get an A plus, whatever that means in the world, by doing level 4 on the grid if the standard's at level 3. So you will have students in different spots, but that's literally how it's always been. And this also identifies, I'm going to stop talking in a minute because I've been going for a while, but this also identifies, I just keep opening up these can of worms. So
that's what we're here for, brother.
This also identifies a huge issue in that those students were always at different places. Now you're just aware of it.
Yes.
So like, that's the biggest thing that I want to take away from this question. You've never ended a unit and not had this be the case, and not had students at different places. Ever, probably, if you're a normal teacher in a regular classroom. Now, you just viscerally feel it because you're tracking their progress, you know where they're at, and you know what you can do to help them in their next steps. So this is not as much of a problem as it's a gift, because now you have the information to do something about it. So I'm not going to get into all the grading practices because that's a whole nother can of worms, but I would just say reference the standard, not how far they get on the grid. Because if you look at every grid and go, if you get to level 5, you're done, or you get an A, and then so on and so forth, you are absolutely setting yourself up for failure because your standard might be at a DOK level 2. And now your kids are drowning way above grade level because that DOK level 3 component of the standard isn't until 2 grade levels ahead or something like that. So you don't want to do that.
I feel like I feel a live session coming on sometime soon where I'm going to put you, Caitlin Giordano, and Dave Schmitto on screen to just talk about grading and assessment.
Yeah,
just saying. That's going to happen. This is a fairly easy one, but there are obviously some scenarios, and if this, then that. 4 was, is a grade provided to each student at the beginning?
Yes.
Most of the time, yes. Sometimes, yeah, most of the time, yes. Sometimes you might provide it differently, right? We've seen in lower levels where you might only provide one level at a time. That's
So the grade is utilized as a student-facing document or something that the student interacts
The
with
grid is utilized, yeah.
regardless. Yes. Did I say grade? The
You said
grid
grid. Yep.
is provided to each student, or it's started with each student so they're aware of it. We've seen some kindergarten classrooms where it's like, here's your next assignment, and the teacher has the grid because they don't want to overwhelm.
Yep.
However, 99% of the time, absolutely, the student has the grid, the teacher has the grid, the administrator has the grid, the superintendent could have the grid. And that's really, if I want to expand a little bit, which I love to do, if I want to expand a little bit, that's one of the powerful components of this document, because it actually speaks to every stakeholder involved in the child's education in a different way, but provides them the information they need. So if you really think about that, if you make a very well-crafted grid and you follow our advice and you've taken the workshop and you've gotten trained in the course or whatever it is, and you've aligned it to your standards, you have a cohesive curriculum document. So for a student, you've created a visual learning path. They know where they are and where they're going, which is very powerful. They know what their objectives are. They know where they're going. They know how they're being assessed. It makes everything very, very apparent, right? From a teacher's standpoint, you have a daily plan for the next however long the grid lasts. So you might have a 3-week plan, a 5-week plan, a unit plan that is now aligned to the standards. For a principal, you now have a curriculum map for each grade level, each class, each part of your school. For a superintendent, you know how your standards are being met, what's being done about it, how you're differentiating, and how instruction is being enacted in all of your classrooms, because it's consistent, it's effective, and it's based with on best practices. So I think that's one of the really powerful things that when we work with districts that they like about this, because it truly gives them something to anchor everything onto. And in remote learning, the grid even becomes a great tool for parents at home helping their kids, because now you can hyperlink all of the needed resources. Everything's in one place, in one document, and you could email it at the beginning of the unit or the week or whatever you want to. But now you've literally used a single document to inform every stakeholder of exactly what's happening in their child's education or the children's education every moment of every day for the entire unit. But the shorter answer was yes, they get a good.
All right, number 5, Jacobson. We're gonna move on to the next one. And you might go on this one too. So
I'll try to contain myself.
Try to stick to it.
I'm gonna be here.
Having the whole class-wide discussions on topics if each student is at a different place in the grid. So I want you to stick to the logistics of this, not the pedagogical thinking of preaching or anything like that. But like, so I'm thinking in my mind, I'm thinking Ray Hewitt, how she runs hers with her discussion, stuff like that, and go.
So I'm just trying to put my limiter on for a second, but so I'm gonna say I'm gonna repeat myself. So I'm gonna repeat a preach from earlier. Your kids are always at different places when you do things like this. Every time you have a discussion, one kid doesn't know what's going on. One kid's participating a ton because they already know all the answers. And most of the time in a discussion, most of the responses are consolidated between like 5 and 10% of your students, while other ones glaze over, look at the ceiling, and draw pictures on their notepad or something like that, even if it's on Zoom, right? So I would argue that knowing where your students are actually from an instructional standpoint is a benefit, because now you can target your questions to every single aspect of your students. So if I'm putting a discussion in place, maybe the first question I ask is from level 1, and I go, if you're in level 1, you should be able to talk and give me some information about this part of the discussion. The other piece is you can backstop your discussion based on progress of your students. So when you notice that all of your students have gotten past level 1, or most of them have at least, you can go, Friday, we're going to have this mini lesson. We're going to have this demonstration. We're going to have this discussion. And I'm going to kind of do a little check based on this discussion about where everyone's at, close up some loose holes and things like that. And now you've kind of closed up any of those gaps, shored them up, and you can plan those discussions much more effectively rather than going, so this is what normally happens during a discussion, and it makes me really mad. So yesterday we've been talking about chapter 7 and 8. So today we're going to have a discussion about it. Well, just because you talked about chapter 7 and chapter 8 doesn't mean that they learned about chapter 7 and chapter 8, right? That could mean some of them did, but it just means that you covered it. If you're in the grid method, you know that they know about chapter 7 or 8 because you've already assessed and shown mastery based on where they are in the grid. So you're absolutely set for those discussions.
I love the fact that your clockwise discussion should be more effective, especially if you're planning them around, if you're planning your questions around that, because like you said, you can hit on those points of, hey, anyone who's gotten past 2A, this is for you. Because even though I might be still on 1C, whatever, and maybe I don't know that yet, I might learn it better because my classmates describing it in their own words, right? Because we talk about all the time how you can learn better from each other when we do peer-to-peer tutoring and stuff like that. So being able to strategize those questions that way is so much more effective that time.
Another note on this is a lot of teachers think that because students are working at their own pace, they can't do things like lecture, lessons, discussions, and things like that, which is one of the biggest misconceptions we deal with in workshops when we're doing trainings at districts. And and we have teachers, literally Ray Hewitt, who runs this amazingly, and most teachers do like 10 to 15 minutes of discussion or mini lesson or some sort of activity every single day. So it's absolutely possible.
All right, next question. Melissa Cunningham. Thank you, Melissa, for it. I'm an instructional coach, and I will be doing a coaching cycle with a teacher on multiplying and dividing fractions. Any ideas for problem-based learning units and real-life applications? We'd like to start proposing a real-world difficult problem and let this be a common thread throughout the unit. Thanks in advance. I don't know if you want to get specific to what she's specifically asked about. Okay, but if you want to go specific, go ahead. Otherwise, let's just touch on the idea of like how problem-based learning going. So this isn't a grid question more. This is a PBL real life application question.
But I do think that the grid could help solve this question in the context of PBL, right? So one of the biggest issues with PBL, I talk about this all the time. If you've ever seen me present, almost ever, I bring this up, right? It's really, really aggravating when you get to the end of a presentation, you've been working, end of a project, and there's presentation day, and you get half your kids go up there and have no idea what's going on when they're presenting, or they can't pronounce the words on their slide. Well, the reason this happens is because you set an arbitrary due date. They kept on working. It sounded like they were doing well, but they weren't actually learning or getting checked or knowing what was going on. And then they ended up presenting because that was the due date. Mm-hmm. If you break the exact same projects up into a grid, you're checking them every single step of the way to ensure that there's mastery. So they don't get to present. They don't get to demonstrate their final artifact or product or solution to the problem that you've presented until they've shown that they've done the work step by step. And if you've ever done PBLs, you know, I'm telling you, this is a universal truth that student projects literally have this arc, right? You get a couple really, really good projects, and then you get like some mid-tier projects, and then the rest just crap out at the bottom. Like, because those students weren't actually ready to demonstrate their mastery, and they got it done by the due date. So we need to take the project, break it up into steps, and focus on learning through the project, not the project as a result of learning. So a lot of times projects in general, okay, the biggest problem is that teachers do them after learning as opposed to during learning, right? And so the project should be while students are learning. Did you not need to jump in for a second? I
was going to have you repeat it, but now it's probably too far from you to be able to remember exactly what you said. But you said it's about that you need, because I wanted to touch on the fact that like this doesn't have to be in the grid method, because I want to make sure that like you understand.
That's true.
That's this is still true. This still unit, and that's why we love the grid method so much, because even if you take out the grid, it still makes sense, right? So this idea of, because it wasn't a grid method specific question, I want to make sure that she gets that, is that what you just touched on was the key, is that it's about breaking down the project and learning through the project versus setting that arbitrary date and then learning and going through the project after. I think that was like the key point to that, of break down the project so they can get through it and go through there. So
in terms of breaking down fractions and things like that, I think a great world application for this would be something like you have to open up a baking business and then scale it. So like you need to basically find a recipe that's for a single person or a single family, and now you have to
scale it based on the volume of your business.
Right. So then you can give the students different scenarios. Each student gets a new scenario as they get better at this, right? They can practice these skills, learn these basic skills. Now, the other cool thing is if you're doing this remotely, I'm thinking like they could actually make cookies at home using their recipes with like, and show pictures of them with your Zoom class, things like that. So, but then having to scale it and say, this is how much your ingredients you had to order. This is how much they cost. This is how much it costs to make a cookie. How much would it cost to make 1,000 cookies? How much would it cost to make? And how many cups would you need? Or how many, what would because I think then you're really kind of getting into real world application, right?
And I don't know what level that is, Chad, but you can go even further. I'm listening. I'm like, you can go even further and bring the like economics in the sense of, and business plan in the sense of like, all right, if your profit or if your gross revenue grows by 25%, what does that mean you have to do as far as customer service? Therefore, what does your recipe have to go? And now you're bringing in percentages and fraction and that stuff. Like, I love that. That's really cool. I'm hungry right now, but
well, if you another way to do this would also
is to just eat everything they make.
Right.
Yes. Gotcha.
Another way to do this would be thinking about traditional US measurement system, right? So like 1 1/8 of an inch, what would be the area of a space you need to plant a garden or something like that? And if you need to double that space, what would that end up being? You'd have to use fractions in the real world, which is why I love science and the metric system, because I didn't have to do that ever, because I would just move a decimal point if I needed to. It was just much easier. But like
it's a whole nother can of worms. All right, so let's keep rolling here. I got one from Dana Elise. It's back on the 16th. I'm virgin on panic mode. School starts for us on the 24th. Teaching middle school math. I technically have 4 preps, but one of those is for 3 very different groups of kids. Half my kids are in person, half remote. I'm at a new school. I've never done a grid, but have been watching the videos and learning, but when I sit down to make mine, I am at a complete loss. The curriculum is new to the district too, and there are only 3 math teachers in the district, and no one else is teaching what I'm teaching. I'm totally freaking out. And go Chad Ostrowski.
So Dana, I just want to tell you, it's gonna be okay. Take a breath and relax. One of the biggest things about grid is you don't have to do it with every class, every minute of every day from day one. If you have 4 separate preps, I actually wouldn't suggest starting with all 4 preps. Now, if you mean you have 4 groups of students that are learning the same thing, which I don't think is what she was saying, then you could make one grid and use it for all 3. However, I would start with your youngest prep. Okay, so if you teach like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math, I'm not sure if she mentioned what grade level she taught.
No, she doesn't. She didn't
so
mention that.
Normally, if you have multiple preps, it's because you're teaching multiple grade levels, right? So you're teaching like 6th, 7th, 8th grade math, for instance. What I would recommend is focus on 6th grade math first. Focus on really shoring that up with the new curriculum and how it goes. Then move over to 7th grade math, then 8th grade. And here's why. Because if you just focus on 6th grade math for the first year, it's okay, because now your 6th grade year is done. Then all those kids know how to use grids that are going to be in your 7th grade class the next year. So then you work on your 7th grade grids. So essentially, if you want to take your time, you could look at over a 3-year process. By the end of 3 years, I will have grids and students who know how to use them by the end of 3 years. Most teachers don't want to wait that long, though. So what most of the time happens is you work out the kinks in the first semester in 6th grade, and then you go 6th and 7th grade second semester, and then you start planning 6th, 7th, 8th by 3rd or 4th semester, or not semester, quarter. And then, but like, just take your time. You don't have to do all of it right now. And I feel like a lot of her problem is she's trying to do it all like immediately.
Possibly. Which got a lot. There's a lot of pieces to that of a new school, new curriculum, and multiple.
Yeah, so take it slow and work out the kinks.
Patience, I think patience is really. I want to push on that, because you touched on that. Like, the patience in this process is really, really important, especially now with all the other factors that are in.
Absolutely.
And I think, like, listen to, like, if you hear how Chad was saying that, they're like, this might be a 3-year process for you, like, and that's okay, because we're not trying. This isn't about trying to find a quick fix. It's about changing the way we teach, right? It's about changing the way we educate kids and people all around. That's not a 1 quarter process to change, right? So it's okay if it takes longer, because if it takes longer and you do it right without killing yourself, it's going to be better for you, for your family, for your students, and for the long term. So really listen in on Chad talking about that patience. That's okay to do that. It's okay to roll it out slow. When we work with districts and schools, we do 3 to 5 year plans. And it's because, and it's very similar. Like, we start with small spots and we go a bit bigger and bigger. It's the same thing as starting with one of your preps and the next one, and the next one. So I love especially if you have multiple years like that, like 5th, 6th, 7th, like that, because now each year you're creating new grids around a different curriculum or subject, but with kids who already know how to use the systems, right? So now you're not doing that same new system, new content. So, sure. Nice job, buddy.
I try. Yeah.
Let's go on from Daphne. Hello, I initially was going to be teaching all subjects to my 3rd graders. I could easily see a mastery grid for math, but now I am teaching ELAR and social studies. I am having a hard time figuring out how to do a mastery grid for reading when we teach a new standard every week. They hop all over the place. Week 1, plot. Week 2, fantasy fiction versus realistic fiction. Week 3, NF nonfiction text features. Does anyone have any advice? I am lost.
So, yeah, there's so many problems with this scenario that I don't know where to start. So, like, the fact that they're saying that, like, a student's going to fully understand plot in 1 week is concerning initially, right? I would also argue, though, that something like plot is going to spiral in every type of story you read. So that's not necessarily something you have to make an entire grid on. You could help start teaching plot in the context of some of those other, excuse me, in some of those other areas. So if I'm having them read a story, I'm also having them focus on the plot points of that story, right? So that might be in multiple grids across multiple units instead of being just a single grid, one and done. And we really have to be careful of this, especially with things like reading, things like even social studies and science and math, right? There are certain skills in every content.
So you know, Chad, that is Daphne agreeing with some of the concerns, I think, maybe, because I'm thinking some of that's coming from, not from her choice, but what's
sure. No, I absolutely understand. Yeah. So curriculum schedules are stupid. I'm just going to go ahead and say that, because you don't know the variable that matters, which is, are the students learning it? Like, you can't just ignore that and go, well, it's been covered, right? So, and this is literally the universal argument for mastery learning. This is the thing that we say all the time. But we really do need to think about which standards are spiraling versus which are those really big focus standards, right? So I would take those units that are not going to be spiraled. I would make those your grids and embed the skills of plot, embed the skills of, and then also you're teaching social studies too. So I'm even thinking one of the biggest social studies standards, and I'm sorry, I don't know what state this is from, but a lot of the social studies standards in most states cover things like primary, secondary sources, things like that. So, like, is there an opportunity to do a social studies grid with reading components for primary sources, citing evidence, things like that? So now you're combining some of your standards into a single grid, kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. Can you cover these things in more of a context way? Those are some of my initial thoughts. So Texas, I don't know what your TEKs say, because that's what you call them in Texas. We know that because we've worked with Texas schools before. But I can't remember the social studies TEKs in what they say, but my guess is that, like, I would combine your non-fictional unit with your historical texts. I would cover both of those in a single project or unit and then cover both of those in a single grid. Now you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So that's going to relieve some pressure and give you more time, even though the learning might take more time. The efficiency of the curriculum planning is now increased, right? So I think it's really about identifying skill in spiraling based standards and then one and done standards. I think that's really the most important thing for, I can't remember her name, Heidi to do.
Daphne.
Daphne, sorry. For Daphne to do. I think that's the most important thing is like identify what you're going to see in every grid you do or every unit you do.
Yeah. So
don't worry about
your one and done standards are in the grids. Your
Correct.
spiral standard, ongoing standards are embedded somewhere in the grid
100%.
or across. Yep.
100%.
Talk about like, I know some people call them soft skills, some are essential skills, but like those are things that are embedded in every grid through the activities that the students are doing throughout the entire year.
To put it into another context, and I actually have an example of a scientific method grid, but like that was because I was showing my students what it was and then applying it later. So it doesn't mean you can't have those grids, but scientific method in a science classroom is something that you should have in every one of your grids. Collecting data and analyzing and graphing data from experiments should be in every one of your grids if you're a science teacher. So I'm not going to have just one grid and then never talk about that stuff again. I'm going to introduce it to mastery to a certain level, and then we're going to use it all year. We're going to spiral it and use it. So I'm not super worried about that grid being one and done because it's going to be used throughout the year.
Love it. Daphne, since you're in here with us right now, does that help? Give me a thumbs up or a heck yeah or absolutely not. Something like that in the comments if you can.
No, Chad sucks.
That's welcome too. That's perfectly fine. You know this. Anyway, so good morning to Kate. Kate jumped in. Nikki, good morning.
Sandra Weir's here.
Sandra, good morning. Good to see all of you there. I'm going to look for Daphne's response to that, and we'll come back if we need to, but I'm going to bring up another one here from Heidi. Just curious, do any of you lead a PLC group in your school / social circle? If so, has anyone created a grid to walk your PLC group and how to use it? I'm assuming she means how to use the grid. I'm thinking to start out the school year, creating norms, sharing ideas, etc. Can you share? I'm not seeing anything in the files that might fit this idea.
So
before you go on, Daphne says, I love it. Thank you. So awesome. Good question, Daphne. Good job, Chad. You can stay, buddy.
Thanks, Tony. So this is interesting. So this could be asking one of two things. I think it's asking to walk a PLC group on how to use the grid, not necessarily
yes. And I think
grid for PLC groups, right?
I think and Heidi, if you're watching, what I think this is, Chad, is basically creating an intro grid for your PLC to learn the grid. That's what I'm reading.
Well, she says creating norms, sharing ideas. So, like, I'm reading it as, and this is just funny because we're literally both reading this question.
Well, maybe she's walking them through how to utilize a grid by creating a grid around.
So I'm going to answer both of these questions.
Yeah, just answer both.
So I actually think that you could create a tracking page and a grid for the focus of the PLC group if you just want to know how the PLC group works, right? So maybe you do like a baby grid to set norms, create those things, and set those up. But then you shouldn't make a PLC group to learn how to do PLC. Does that make sense? Like that fundamentally doesn't necessarily make sense to me. However, PLC groups should be focused on an objective. So maybe your PLC group is focused on reaching more students, in introducing the grid method to people. So the way that would work is you could create, using our free course, using the resources we have, using discussions of, or give me a call. I can help run that PLC group too. Like that's cool too. But what you can do is you can start the process of making grids, make the first part of the PLC group, or maybe the first quarter, learning how to make grids, learning what that looks like, whether that's accessing the academy or getting information. The second quarter, then you could start implementing grids, and then your PLC group becomes your support group. You can talk about what's working, what's not working, how you're implementing it. In terms, I think that makes sense to me because the PLC group should really be a trial and error and discuss and improve the process, not necessarily like everyone follow the grid for PLC. Although we have done a lot of PD grids, that is a thing that gets done. So
you could almost introduce a grid to your PLC by having
a
it
grid.
be sort of like, this is how our PLC is going to run. Here's the
Sure.
norms, here's the systems, here's the tools we're using to introduce. So it really depends on what that is. So Heidi, if that didn't get you what you needed,
Yeah,
I know a lot of
know.
people jumped in and offered her a lot of support in the group as well already. But if you want to chat more about that, reach out to Chad. And if you want to build that, it sounds like maybe she's leading the PLC there. So like,
Sure.
that'd be good to do. So last one I got for us is from Becky. Becky Thaw.
Becky.
We'll call him Murph. And she's asking, she made it nice and long for me. Geez. Is anyone teaching students in person and remote simultaneously? And if so, what are you doing to make that work effectively? Preparing to return in a few weeks, and this is what our school is doing. Thanks in advance. Edit. Just to clarify, the majority of the students are attending in person 5 full days. The remote students have chosen all virtual, so will never physically be in the room, at least for the first market period. It's not a hybrid model. Remote students are expected to be on with us live via Google Meets for 4 hours. Just looking for suggestions on how to logistically keep everyone engaged at the same time. So she's actually going to have remote students streaming into her class as she's teaching her class, which – Chad, I don't know if you remember, we've seen this a couple of times. It's been a while since we've seen a class, but we've actually seen a few grid method class runs where they have like I can't remember. I think it was down in Cincinnati Public. We had a school where he had a whole nother school.
He did. You're right.
School building. Now that's different than being at home, but every single day he had a big screen and that had a whole nother class on it. So my vision is like, you could do that, but that screen, whether it's a projector or a big or whatever monitor, like that's your Zoom or your Google Meet. I think she said Google Meet is where all your students come in from there. Obviously, there's a logistics in creating the routines for muting yourself, talking out of turn, all, because you have people that are in person in there. But that's in my mind one way that you could do this, Becky, is you have them on a screen where the students in the class can see them. They can see each other if they choose to have video on. So now they have the ability to actually have that connection a little bit too, and then they're there with you. I mean, yeah, you can get into like having the cameras that follow you and all that stuff. That gets a little more expensive, so you have to find out what you can or cannot do. But that's where my thought went initially, Chad. But I'll let you go more. If you want to go on the logistics, that's good too. She has asked about logistics. I think the pedagogy behind it as well also is really important in this type of situation. But
I agree. So the logistics of this become more challenging in a teacher-centered classroom.
Yes.
Right? Like, so if we're looking at the idea of when instruction is taking place, it's when the teacher is talking and keeping a video screen of students engaged at the same time as kids in the class, and they're all doing the exact same thing. That's going to be most people's gut reaction. I'm just going to talk for 30 to 40 minutes and then like hopefully everyone's paying attention, and then like we're going to move on with our life.
Yeah.
However, if my response to Becky was like, I think I might know something that could help you, and she knew I was talking about the grid, but like my gut reaction for obvious reasons is like, if you make a grid and they're all following it, when you're in that live, I don't know if she's 4 hours straight with the same group, but I'm assuming at least an hour with a group. You could create purposeful small groups that are mixed with kids from the Zoom call and live kids that you go do small group with while the rest of the class is working on the other parts of the grid or wherever they are on the grid. So like, if you really think about it, what you could do is, if I'm Becky, the logistics of this would be something like, and by the way, Google Meets, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I've seen multiple articles, they are introducing breakout rooms or something like breakout rooms that Zoom has. I don't know if you've heard about that too.
I've heard it, but there's a lot of stuff out there right now, but a lot of changes potentially coming. So hopefully that's one of the things.
So let's assume you can do a breakout room, or you can do a Google Meet with breakout rooms, or a Zoom call with something, okay? Logistically, the way I would do this is I would set up a computer for like all of the kids on Zoom to work, right? And then I would set up another user that's like, here's the breakout room with the other kids that are live in the class that are also where the kids in the breakout room are that are stuck on level 1. Yeah. So if I'm Becky, the first 10 to 15 minutes of my class, maybe I do my mini lesson, I get my kids started on their grid so they're working focused independently, and then I go, no one's getting checked off, no one's getting signed off for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to go to that station and I'm going to interact with the computer screen could have 1, 2, or 5 kids on it, and whoever else is sitting in that same area, socially distanced probably, and then I can go, okay, let's go through 1A on your grid or 1B on your grid. Then after that, you can keep them in the breakout room, check back every 5-10 minutes or whatever you need to, and make sure that they're getting what they need. Logistically, that is absolutely how I would run that.
Yeah.
I can't logistically see a better way in my own mind, other than creating that learning path and focusing your live time. And this gets back to something we've been saying to a lot of districts. Focus your live time on helping and intervening and motivating and meeting with your students one-on-one. You can record yourself talking for 40 minutes. Mm-hmm. That is not, and you can quote me on this as much as you want. That's the stupidest use of your time if you have 45 minutes with your kids live once a week or twice a week. That makes zero sense to me, why you would waste all of that time. Okay, everybody open up your Zoom calls. Even though we can fully interact for the first time all week, I'm going to talk at you for 45 minutes. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
Maybe 10 minutes, a mini lesson, go over some things, but then you need to get them learning and working on the work so you can help them on the work, on the learning, on mastering more concepts, on closing gaps, on intervening where they need help. That's how we need to utilize our time when it's live. And that to me is like a non-negotiable. Any teacher using 60 minutes a day live with their kids to talk at them is wasting 60 minutes a day with their kids. I'm going to go ahead and say that. You can record it, even though this is recorded.
It is recorded.
Live. But I'm sorry, but you are. Even though that's the lowest common denominator of instruction. If you really think about it, we are reverting to the lowest form of instruction, which is I'm going to tell you all the things you need to know. You're going to go do the work later in some other point. But I want students working when I'm there, not later, when I can't help them.
Yeah, I think the catch is even though they're required to be with you live, you should still be structuring it for them to be able to learn on their own, asynchronous need, right? Because then the remote learners and the people in the classroom, they can still go get the work and do the work without being in your room either way. Because at some point there might be that half that's in the room might not be able to be in the room for part of your year too. So again, it goes back to planning everything as if everyone is 100% virtual all the time, and then enhancing it if you have 100%. Time. So right now, Becky, if you plan it all 100% virtual, the best you possibly can, now you do have some time when they're either going to be live with you in person or live with you streaming into your room. Now enhance it, like Chad is saying, with small group, with intervention, with some maybe additional mini lessons, things like that. I think that's the key, because then if something happens and everyone has to go virtual, they're still getting that best you could create path, right? And that learning that they have there. So good stuff. Becky knows how to find you.
I think she does.
That's the last one I got. So that's what I had right there, Chad. So we're good. We've been on about 48 minutes. This was good. Make sure you're good. You've put in 48 minutes. You can go take a nap now. Take the rest of the day off. Man. Whatever you need to do, my friend. If you're listening on the podcast, do me a favor, hit subscribe, give us a rating and review. We really appreciate that. Make sure you get into the group over at teachbettergroup.com over here on Facebook. Everyone in the group, thank you for chiming in. Everyone who's watching on Twitch and YouTube and over on Periscope, appreciate you jumping in and continue to do that. Get in the group, ask questions. You can ask questions on any of the other platforms too, by the way. So, but that group really does have a great support system already in there for even when I can't get Chad on camera like this. There's a lot of support in there. So keep reaching out, and maybe we'll do this again next week. We'll come live one morning and just cover some of the questions that are going on and do that and work on more stuff like that. So appreciate y'all. Have an awesome Friday. And I think Chad said it somewhere in there, but with all this stuff, take a breath. You're going to be okay. You're good at what you do. Teachers are ready to adapt. So we appreciate you. Have an awesome, awesome Friday. We'll see you.